Just a couple of minutes past, so I think we'll start with tonight's lecture. So it's my great pleasure to introduce John Rogers as tonight's speaker. John is someone I've known for quite a few years now, since he started at Swansea University as an undergraduate student. And I remember doing a seminar for John's class at the time, and I wouldn't say being stuck in the lift, but we were stuck in the lift going down in the building, and we had a good chat about Egypt at the time. And you could already see with John in his first year that he was very dedicated to Egyptology, and this is really shown throughout his studies. John was also visiting Egypt that summer, and so I invited him to come and visit the work that I've been doing in the South Asif necropolis with his parents. So that was a great experience for him. And John is now a team member of the South Asif Conservation Project, where he has worked for three seasons, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, 3. Yeah.
As an excellent team member as well. So John did his undergraduate at Swansea with his dissertation topic on music, and he's been very much interested in music, both in modern times as well as in antiquity. And many of you will know he's part of a conference which is coming up in September, which Heidi Koop, our speaker on Sunday, recently talked about. So John is one of the organizers of that. And he has worked on our musical instruments in the Egypt Center, including our mysterious flute, if it is a flute or whistle. You can find that talk on YouTube, which Sam can post into the chat. He then did his MA in Swansea with an excellent dissertation, which I think, was it a mark of 95 or 93?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it was an extremely impressive high mark. I don't think there's really been a mark quite like it, and maybe Alan knows of other ones that there's been in the department. So John is an excellent student, and we're very happy that he did receive funding from Swansea University in order to conduct his PhD at Swansea University, which is looking at the administration of Egypt during the early 26th dynasty, which will be part of the topic of tonight's lecture. So over to you, John, and thank you very much for agreeing to speak to the friends.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Ken, for such a warm introduction. I remember that conversation in the lift on the way down off that seminar, and talking to this genius of a man who seemed to have a photographic memory, and I've still never met anyone who has quite the same memory or analytical mind as Ken Griffin. So thank you very much for such a warm introduction, and for inviting me to join you here this evening. And let me just work out how to share my slides. Here we go. So let me start with a story. A few weeks ago, there was a burglary just down the street from where I'm sitting. The police were slow to the scene, and when they did arrive, their investigations had the distinct air of routine about them. It later became clear that this had been the latest in the long line of burglaries, a number of which had happened in a village about 3 miles down coast from here. After taking statements, the police returned to their station and haven't been seen since. Nothing's been heard from them since then. Understandably, the majority of the residents along this street were disgruntled by this series of events and lackluster reaction by the police. But let's say that one particular inhabitant, let's call her Edith, decides that, well, if the police won't do anything, well, she will. So Edith takes her gun, she goes out, and she finds this burglar. She takes him back and locks him in her basement. She provides this prisoner with food and water so that he doesn't starve, but she plans to keep him locked up for a couple of years to teach him a lesson. And she decides that she should do this with every criminal that she can find. But she doesn't stop there. Oh no, she goes around from door to door among her neighbors. And as they each answer the door in turn, she asks each one of them, have you noticed the reduction in crime over the last few weeks? The neighbors each nod along, to which Edith replies, well, that's thanks to me. She goes on to explain her anti-crime program. And at this point, pretty much all the neighbors are attempting to quietly shut the door and get away from this mad woman, but she carries on. Anyway, she says, I'm here to collect your contribution for this month, for the Crime Prevention Fund. And the contribution for the year, we'll say, your contribution this year is £250. But that's not all. Edith continues. She explains to each of the neighbors that if they refuse to give her the money, then she will also place them in her basement and label them a criminal. And furthermore, indicating the gun that she's carrying, she tells them that she is prepared to take them by force if she needs to. Well, if you were one of these neighbors, how would you respond to Edith at your front door? Well, I would be worried about the mental health of Edith and also for my own physical safety. She shouldn't be wandering around the town with a gun. But more than that, I imagine that most of us, if confronted by Edith, would agree that we don't owe her anything. We may give her the money out of fear, but we wouldn't feel duty-bound to do so. And secondly, I imagine that most of us would find her actions outrageous. Her accosting of burglars is little more than kidnapping, and her demands for money are definitely extortion. In fact, Edith's delusion that the rest of the village owes her something would make most of us question her sanity. Well, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this story. In the story, Edith has taken on the central tenets of a rudimentary government. Firstly, she punishes people who violated the rights of others or who disobeyed her commands. And secondly, she collects non-voluntary contributions to finance her activities. In our government, in the UK, these are called the criminal justice system and the tax system. And yet when the government performs these actions, we applaud it. Most people support the state's imprisonment of criminals, feel obligated to pay their taxes, and consider the punishment of tax evaders both desirable and within the rights of government. When you receive your council tax bill, if you're unfortunate to have to be paying council tax, you feel obliged to pay. And part of that tax is for the crime commissioner, the head of police. And as a child, I thought that meant that there was someone whose job it was to commission crime. But this all leads to a key idea. Governments and states are considered ethically permitted to do things that others may not. And individuals have obligations to the state that no other person or organization can demand. But the question is why? Well, often when we come to this question, the reason is the who rather than the what. So Edith is wrong because while she's acting like the state, she is not the state. And we call this political authority, the perceived moral virtue that allows a government to do things that others may not. But this doesn't really answer the question. And if we can frame it a different way, what makes Edith different to Boris Johnson or any Prime Minister? Well, as soon as I ask this question, many people in a Western setting will feel compelled to answer that the latter has been democratically elected by the population to function as the leader of the government and implement the processes of statehood on our behalf. One is democratically elected, the other is not. But there are two problems with this. The first is that such a decision was not completely democratic. What I mean is that we did not all choose for Boris Johnson or any Prime Minister to make decisions on our behalf. So 100% of the voting population made a decision as to whether or not to exercise their right to vote. Well, that was a democratic decision. 100% made the choice to vote or not. And 66% of those, I've drawn the statistics from the 2019 election, 66% of the population voted. of that 66%, 43% voted Conservative, and then therefore with Boris Johnson at the head. So around 30% of the total population voted for Boris Johnson. So it's not truly democratic, as only 3 in 10 people actually made a decision to invest governmental authority in him. But the second problem is more serious for our purposes tonight. If the reasons why states exist as legitimately functional agents that have abilities above all others is because they are given that power by a democratic process, then the majority of statehood configurations in the world today, and almost all historical configurations, are straight away illegitimate. There were no elections in ancient Egypt as far as we can tell. So if the legitimacy of the state is dependent on a democratic decision, there was no legitimate Egyptian state from our perspective. Many countries around the world today, by the same perspective, have no legitimate state, even though they are recognized by other states that we would think of as legitimate. And you can play a drinking game for every time I say state if you want. But what's more is, if this is the case, then there were no political obligations that could be enforced before democratic state structures. But most of us would disagree with this statement quite strongly. And most of us would say that there was at least one ancient Egyptian state. And most of us would argue that there are often more obvious political obligations in non-democratic structures. So we come back to the question of why. Why do populations allow states to function? Or more simply, how do states work? And this rather long introductory story has only served one purpose: to illustrate that states can and should be questioned. The state exists as long as you don't look at it. Once you look at it, the justifications start to unravel. And my research is looking at the building of a new state at the beginning of the Sayyid dynasty, that's linked to previous ones, under the king Psamtik I. The previous centuries had seen political fragmentism and a change from a unified two lands to something resembling city-state polities, and I'm very wary in using that term. But the reign of Psamtik I, well, it marks a change in statehood, with a newly unified Egypt that uses classical ideological structures and narratives. On the outside, it looks like a return to normal, but of course there's no such thing as normal. There are different forms of statehood, and I'm examining that development, its justifications, its rationalizations. So, for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm not going to go into a deep case study with the Sayyid era or anything like that, but what I'm going to do is give an overview of the working parameters as I'm working on them. The first 20 minutes or so, I'll work through 2 or 3 of the key theoretical concepts, terms that we use without thinking. And I'll be using these concepts from political and statehood theory as I understand them, and that is a process that's ongoing. But then I'll start applying them to Egyptian kingship in different eras to see how these concepts, as we define them, hold up in a pharaonic setting. And hopefully you'll find this interesting, but even if you don't find it interesting necessarily, I hope that you'll see that it's at least important. And some of these definitions may be very fruitful in the future for digging underneath the skin of royal ideology to see what's actually happening underneath the level of formal texts. After all, formal sources are often slow to change and hide a lot of the day-to-day variability. And I hope these concepts can start to unpick our opening question of who actually ran the ancient Egyptian state, or any state for that matter, including our own. So let's jump in. Well, the first concept is that of power. And we use this word very loosely and uncritically. But what is power? Well, this can and is and will continue to be debated, but I would have a working definition of power as the ability to physically make desires come to pass. So you want something to happen and you are able to make it happen. In statehood contexts, this nearly always manifests itself as a threat of physical violence. And we can call this structural violence. And this is more clear in some states than others. In fact, it seems that the stronger a state gets, the more the threat of physical violence is hidden. Take the UK, for example. The threat of physical violence is very much hidden for the most part. We used to have public executions, and then the executions happened in the Tower of London behind closed doors, and now we don't have any at all. The state gets stronger. When the state does show any form of physical violence, such as at the protests at Saturday just gone, it is shocking. And this is because ordinarily that threat of physical violence is hidden. And this may be because in a modern Western state setting, the state is inside us. And this is quite a strange concept, I know. And this is called Panopticonism. The Panopticon was a prison, which became a prison design, where the guard can see every prisoner. He's in the middle. But the prisoner can't tell whether the guard is watching him or not on this one-way glass. So he has to assume that he's always being watched by the guard. Well, how does this look? Well, say you're driving along a deserted country road where you can see in all directions for miles, and you're driving and you come across a set of red lights. You can see that there's nothing coming. Now, whether you decide to stop or not, there will be something in your mind telling you you should stop. Why? There's no danger, but perhaps you're worried that there's a police car somewhere, even though you can't see it. Well, there's an argument that voice compelling you to stop at those lights in case there's a police car watching you is the voice of the state within you. You become your own police. So the state doesn't need to intervene as much because the population is doing it for them. And this is a sign of a very strong statehood configuration. Most states don't have this. In most states, the law has to be more rigorously enforced. But every government, every state, enforces itself, if eventually, through the threat of physical force. Direct physical violence is rarely used as a punishment in Western systems. But say you ignore that voice in your head and drive through the red light, but somehow you notice there's a police car which starts following you. So you pull over and the officer speaks to you. Well, what does she say? Well, you may just have a warning, but you may be ordered to pay a fine. But this is just another command. And if you broke the command to stop at the traffic lights, why would you obey the command to pay a fine? Well, perhaps that command is enforced by another command. If you do not pay the fine, your driver's license will be removed. But again, this is just another command. Why would you obey this one? Well, if you don't hand over your license, you might be threatened by imprisonment. And if you refuse to go to prison, you will be physically manhandled into the police car and physically manhandled into the prison. So the state uses power to enforce its desires. Our laws are commands that are backed up by other commands, but eventually these commands have to end in a threat the violator literally cannot defy. And because the violator cannot defy the threat, the state has power. Now, this is different in ancient Egypt and almost all ancient societies. In the ancient world, physical violence is very much displayed, is very much on show. And we'll come on to this in a minute. And this idea of the state's use of power fits in with the ideas of Max Weber, a very influential writer, who is often misquoted as identifying the state as the monopolization of violence. That's not what he actually said. In fact, what he says is that a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So basically, states claim a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So in all eras of ancient Egypt, it is the king who is shown killing others. When an official is shown, it is almost invariably delegated by the king. So power is not a thing, it's not a possession that can be gained or removed, but it's a relationship between persons, where one or more has the ability to coerce another or others to do what they desire. Now, the second concept is authority, and this is different to power. While power has the ability to enforce your desire, authority is more multifarious. And I love this image here. If you want to waste an hour getting away from work, take a look at the bookcase Credibility. There's some phenomenal stuff on there. But there are different types of authority. There's the theoretical authority, which this woman is trying to be, and there's the practical authority. And we can think of these differences as being an authority and being in authority. So the first, a theoretical authority. Well, this is a person who is an authority because they know more than me. So in Zoom meetings, we often see people trying to display their theoretical authority by having impressive bookcases in the background to hint to their greater knowledge. Look at how much I've read. I have read more than you. Therefore, you should listen to me. But the second person is in authority because they are put there by themselves or by others. So that police officer who pulls you over on that deserted country road, well, that police officer has practical authority. They've been placed in that position, in this case by the state. And I want to avoid a particular definition of authority because it's a slippery topic with lots of debates. But authorities provide reasons to believe them and reasons to act based on their superior standing. So if you go to your doctor and they tell you that you need treatment, you will believe them because they know more than you, and you will act on it because if you don't, there will be a consequence for your health. And this may be part of the reason why doctors and nurses make the worst patients. The relationship of authority is broken. But the doctor is not coercing you. Your doctor has authority, but no power. But there are other kinds of authority. So there's de facto and legitimate authority, and we hear more about this in Egyptology. But the thing which binds all of these forms of authority together is that they are given. And this is one of the main differences to power. So here tonight, you have given authority to me for an hour or so. I received a very warm and kind introduction at the start that not only told you who I am and what I do, but also quietly explained to you why you should listen to me and and grant me the authority to speak to you. In other words, the introduction was the first of many tools to show you that I am an authority who should be believed. At the moment, I am the only person allowed to speak in this space. Everyone else has been muted, and in maintaining that, the moderators are continually sustaining my authority by removing other voices, a continual vote of confidence. Each of you has trusted the organizers of the lecture series, and in inviting me to speak, I know what I'm talking about, at least to some extent. And of course, you may be changing your minds as I speak. But in giving that authority, you expect me to vindicate that gift by demonstrating that I am indeed someone who is an authority. And if I do, then you accept my authority. And that's the difference between authority and legitimacy for me. While that difference is very hotly debated, I would define legitimacy as that reflexive acceptance of authority. And we can discuss legitimacy a little bit later on. I'm still working on legitimacy and validity. But say I start saying things that are patently wrong, that I start going off topic, and maybe you think that I never got on topic, I've not talked too much about Egypt yet. Well, then in that case, you may start questioning my authority. And in that questioning, I start losing my position as a legitimate authority. And we see these narratives of authority a lot in ancient Egypt, which we'll get to in a moment. So that's power and authority. And if someone has both power and authority, then they have domination. And this is where we get the strongest states. The new kingdom is to an extent defined by domination. But even in these times, we run into problems, because in giving certain rights to an institutional apparatus that others do not have, we create an inequality between people that is neither natural nor easy to justify, as states are inherently unequal. And that's the great Western experiment of, can we have statehood and equality together? But this inequality is especially obvious when we consider that the state is formed of institutional apparatus, and these apparatus are filled by people. So why do these people have rights that those outside do not? Well, when we come to ancient Egypt, thankfully, we don't have to make the judgment decisions that we do in our own society. We don't have to wrestle with these really quite difficult problems of justifying a state that we found at the beginning. Rather, we have to try and understand the mechanics behind the forms of statehood, and there are several, the forms that we encounter in the source material. So for the last 25 minutes, I'll try and begin applying these concepts to pharaonic Egypt and really go at them at a more theoretical level, trying to illuminate the use of these concepts in weaving together sometimes disparate understandings of statehood across the millennia of ancient Egypt, as long as the concepts are used consistently. So, I mentioned earlier that the stronger a state is, usually the more hidden the threat of physical violence becomes. And this is true in ancient Egypt. You may not believe it, but this is true, but not to the extent that we are used to. So for us, the use of violence in ancient Egypt is very obvious. Whenever you walk around a temple, there are endless scenes of smiting. But let's take a closer look. Well, on the left here is the Nama palette, and here the king is violent towards his enemies. He smites them with a mace, and on the other side we have emasculated and decapitated persons. And of course this isn't unusual. This is a motif that goes down throughout the whole of pharaonic history. But the death of the early kings of Egypt was accompanied by the mass murder of retainers. And of course we can speculate as to the reasons for the rapid emergence and disappearance of such customs. But this is clearly not a stable state structure. More stable structures turned away from human sacrifice. Later on, the royalty no longer show their physical violence by mass murder of their own people. But there are other ways of showing violence, the most powerful of which is creating and enforcing an us and them. So the king is responsible for maintaining Ma'at and repelling Isfet, which is personified by outsiders. So the king is able to show his ability for physical violence, but one step removed. And so the king no longer shows violence against his own people. It's one step hidden by being shown in relation to outsiders. But when we get to the first intermediate period, state structures seem to be weaker than they were. And it's probably quite telling that we start to see Egyptians depicted as victims of the king again. That the physical violence is less hidden, is more obvious. It needs to be to maintain and preserve power. And it just comes back to my mind that the second dynasty king, Kasekemwi, is said to have killed Delta dwellers. but that's quite some time before, and it's probably indicative of some weakness in the state structure there. But of course, the gods then are rulers extraordinaire. They have ultimate power. They are ever ready to be violent against humanity with pestilence, disease, even invasion. So kings often utilize reference to the power of the gods to show their own authority. The powerful gods give authority to the king, and so the population should too, or otherwise the gods are ready with the threat of physical violence. It's one step removed again. And of course, the second principle, authority, is entangled in this. My separating out of terms is really rather unrealistic. But the king must be both an authority and in authority, a theoretical and practical authority to be successful. The king is an authority to every other mortal because he is fundamentally different. In depictions, he is larger than everyone else except for gods, as you can see on these examples and all over Egypt. But he's also the mediator between humanity and the divine. The exact nature of this mediatorial role changes over pharaonic history, of course, but it's always there in some sense. Here we have the Kushite ruler Pia or Pianki, 25th dynasty, between the local submissive rulers, smaller than him, and acknowledging him as more powerful and therefore giving him authority, and the gods. And of course, in the everyday machinations, this mediation is delegated to various priesthoods. And this fits perfectly fine. Delegation is a privilege of authority. And you cannot delegate a task unless it is yours to delegate. But the king is also different from other mortals because he is responsible for engaging with the outside world. And this isn't definitive, but this is usual. He's responsible for maintaining Ma'at and Isfet, but he's also responsible for obtaining sacred materials, which are brought into the ordinary world of the homeland. And of course, on a practical level, being able to control the flow of precious materials becomes an important mechanism for maintaining theoretical authority over elites. Look at the materials I can bring in. I can bring in more than you. You should give me authority. But we see the authority of the king, which is given by the gods in obtaining sacred materials in several instances. A well-known example of which are the biats, which we can translate as the wonders, or perhaps the miracles, although I'm not such a fan of miracle as a translation. But these biats, which are recorded in the Wadi Hammamat during a quarrying expedition in the reign of Mentuhotep IV. And I'm very glad to see Professor Lloyd here tonight, who is really the authority on this. But there are texts that tell us, and I'm using Lloyd's translation here, it was the majesty of this august god, lord of the desert lands, who paid attention to his son Nebtawira, may he live forever, in order that his heart might rejoice and that he might continue living on his seats forever and ever, and might perform millions of said festivals. And there's a second one, much longer. The second marvel, the issuing of a divine command, the seeing of the manifestation of this God, the displaying of his power to the lapwing folk, the making of the desert into a flood, the bringing forth of water from the rough surface of the rock, the finding of a well in the midst of the wadi, filled with water to its brim, being pure and clean from gazelles and hidden from desert nomads. Expeditions of the ancestors and the kings who had existed before had come forth and returned on its sides. No eye saw it, no face of man fell upon it. It was revealed to his majesty himself, for furthermore he, the god Min, had concealed it, knowing this exact moment, having planned the issue of this moment in order that his power might be seen and that the efficient power of his majesty might be known. He doing something new in his desert lands for his son Neb-Tawi-Ra. Well, the Beats are connected explicitly to the king because the god Min has noticed the king and wants the king to rejoice and enjoy a long reign, because the king is doing the right thing according to the god. The king is different to every other mortal because he enjoys a special relationship with the divine realm. Therefore, us mortals should follow the king, who himself is under the power of the god who is giving him authority over the rest of humanity. And the king as a subject under the gods is also shown way back in the time of Narma, thinking about it, when the mace heads are sized and placed for the hands of the gods, not the hands of men. But of course, in many eras, it wasn't the king who went, but other persons. The story of Wenamun comes to mind. But in these situations, such persons are either working with reference to the king or conspicuously without reference. And so the eras of the nomarchs makes for an interesting reconfiguration of statehood in this kind of context. But all these things demonstrate that the king is an authority because he is different to even the highest officials in his kingdom, particularly shown by things like size and placement, which is indicative of his superior standing. But as well as being an authority, the king is also in authority. That is, he is a practical authority. And this is very easily demonstrated in ancient Egypt. I've already touched on it. The difficult questions that I asked of our own statehood structures are very easily answered in ancient Egypt. His authority is given by the divine realm. And we have this in our own history in the UK as well, where historically the royal family were placed there by God. But the king is not only fundamentally different to us, but he has been given different rights and obligations to us. And this authority is demonstrated over and over again in the building programs of kings, not only in the texts, but in the iconography which all can see. The appeal to a divine authority is particularly clear when there's some reason for suspicion. So there are the Beats of Mentuhotep IV, but here's a relief showing the conception of Amenhotep III in Luxor Temple, showing him as divine offspring, and therefore being given authority by the gods and having the authority of a semi-divine being. But why do gods give authority? Well, they give authority because they have power incomparable. And this leads us on to another key point. Power usually leads to authority, but authority is more stable than power. Why? Well, because it's difficult to continually revert to the threat of violence to maintain a state structure. And we see this in revolutions and coups. Once a government loses its authority and has to revert to violence, it is usually approaching collapse. So a statehood structure comes about most often through power, but its maintenance requires authority. And we see this in the relationship between power and authority in failed usurpations and civil wars. An example is the civil war between Ha'aibre and Ahmose II in the middle to late Saite dynasty. The historically legitimate ruler was Ha'aibre, the son of Psamtik II. According to Herodotus, he sent his Egyptian forces into a battle and they were heavily defeated, while his Greek mercenaries remained safely stationed. Many believed that Ha'aibre had sent the Egyptian troops to their doom because he preferred his mercenary troops, and this bred discontent. And continuing with Herodotus, the Egyptians proclaimed their general, Ahmose, king, and marched against Ha'aibre, who lost and fled. But if we set aside the issues of historicity, what actually happens here? Well, Ha'aibre has the authority and the power to send an army into battle. If they refuse, there will be the threat of physical violence against them. So Ha'aibre has power over them. But when they are routed, Ha'aibre loses authority over them. They no longer give authority to him. Now Ahmose, well, his power hasn't changed. He was commanding the army when they were true to Ha'aibre, and he is still commanding the army. But the difference is that he now has authority. So we have two people who both have power and authority over some sector, different sectors, but some sector of the population. And we have civil war. Whichever one can increase both their power and their authority will win. And now, of course, Herodotus may have some details wrong, but he seems to have gotten the broad strokes correct. The only contemporary account is the Elephantine Stela of Ahmose, which refers to some of these events. But interestingly, that stela begins with Ahmose already in the palace, already victorious, already with both power and authority, and therefore already legitimate. And what is more, as a text standing before both humanity and the gods, he is a legitimate authority before humanity and the gods. In another instance, we see Ramesses XI. Well, he has authority, but he has no power. But Pa-Nehesi has power, but without authority. And of course, Pa-Nehesi is given authority by some, and that's the key part. So power is necessary in the short term. Authority was needed for the long term. So broadly speaking, and I'm aware that I've not dived into the Egyptian evidence for legitimacy so much, the Egyptian king, responsible for the state, well, he needs divine approval. He needs legitimacy, and he attempts to procure legitimacy, or self-legitimizes, through the textual, iconographic, and architectural programs. But the king is also a source of legitimacy, a source of authority and power for others. And this is where I want to spend the last few minutes before wrapping things up. Authority is given to the king by the priesthood acting on behalf of the gods. We can see this in the Nitocris adoption stela, for example. This, and sorry, I can't find a better photo, but this is a foundational document for the early Sayyid era. After centuries of political fragmentism, Psamtik I has his daughter Nitocris adopted to be the future god's wife of Amun, which is the crowning moment of his reunification. But the stela is cleverly laid out to explain the support that the king has from the temples and priesthoods of the land, and therefore the gods. He is given authority by the gods to use his power if necessary. But of course, the purpose of showing this authority is to avoid the need for physical violence. But the king also gives power and authority to officials, and things are getting very metaphysical here. In this rather rudimentary diagram on the left, the A represents the king, and B is an official, and C are the official's peers. But the king gives power and authority to an individual official, say to complete some administrative task. And that authority legitimizes that official in front of his or her peers. Because the peers see the authority and give the legitimacy, they see the king as a source of power and give him further authority in the hopes that he will give them power and authority. And if you struggle to follow that, I struggle to follow that too. So for officials, the king becomes a honeypot for obtaining more power and authority and the legitimacy which goes along with it in their local setting. So in the 5th dynasty, we see that the officials, Ptah Shepses, a high priest of Ptah, and Wazpatah, the vizier, well, they memorialize for eternity in their inscriptions that they were given the honor of kissing the king's feet rather than the ground in front of the feet. The king is an authority, fundamentally distant, aloof, far away, but he's also a source of power and or authority for his officials, who embody statehood in local context. So again, in the Sayyid dynasty, it's really the best era. We see something similar, though the relationship has changed. On a statue currently held in Richmond and published by Anthony Leahy 10 years ago, an official by the name of Sematawi Tefnacht states that he is the eyes of the king in Upper Egypt, his spokesman in Lower Egypt, herald of the king in his every place, a member of the inner circle of the king, one to whom the king speaks in private, master of the secrets of the king in his every place, who loves his Lord and who is beloved of his Lord, who does not allow a prisoner to languish in misery, who introduces to his Lord one who reports a misfortune, who enters every part of the palace and who brings it about that he, the petitioner, comes forth and that he is satisfied. Well, here, Sematari Tefnach is presenting his position as a mediator between the people and the king who is himself a mediator between the people and the god. And while the titles may be formulaic, they still express the closeness of the person with the king. He is closer than you or me, so we should go to him with our issues because he has power to act on our behalf. And in doing so, we give him authority. And if he does what we ask, well, he will be legitimate. In a local context, Sematari Tefnach has powers and authorities that embody the state within that locality. For locals, officials are the state. Pharaoh is a distant institution mostly. And this works very well until the officials receive too much power and authority and begin to challenge the king because they have power and or authority that is similar to the king. And this is why the king must rely on divine authority. And I've avoided the question of whether kings or the office of kingship is divine. But they rely on divine authority because it is the one source of authority that cannot be taken by anyone else, except by the priesthood. And that's what we see towards the end of the New Kingdom, of course. So everyone needs everyone else. And the most stable structures feature and show domination over the territory. And I've not touched on territory either. So we can speak of Ramesses II having more domination than, say, Ramesses XI. And no third intermediate period ruler can really claim to have domination outside of a specified area. And on an interesting side note, it's always bothered me a little bit during the third intermediate period. Several people can all claim to be pharaoh at the same time, particularly in the Delta. They're only several kilometers from each other, so they must know of each other's existence. But perhaps we read political history through the ideology too literally, expecting Pharaoh and Egypt to go together. Perhaps in that era, the foundations of kingship and what it means to be and be able to use Pharaoh is changing, but that's another day. So to wrap it all up then, we can say that obviously Egyptian statehood structures changed over the millennia of pharaonic history, though a large part of it is hidden underneath ideology, which rarely changes or stays up to date. But there were different models of statehood that developed, and I've only touched on the very broadest of strokes tonight. I've tried to define some concepts that we use all of the time that may help us to unravel the everyday processes and the concepts behind those processes. Everyday processes that operate behind the endless scenes of smiting, and which include actors from all sectors of society. And I've attempted to have the working definitions for these concepts, which I'll happily admit are still coming out of the fog and still quite rough around the edges, which as I'm sure that you've noticed. But in looking to answer the title question, who ran the ancient Egyptian state, I can give you a very concise answer, which I'm sure you're glad to hear. And the answer is everyone. Everyone is involved. Yes, there are vastly different levels of ability for involvement. The king in Memphis can do far more than the farmer in Siwa can. But all are involved in the processes of giving or receiving authority and of using or abusing power relations. And that's true both in pharaonic Egypt and today. States have always existed on some level, even if that's a household level. And in studying different configurations of statehood from our own, we are forced to confront the significant issues we face here and now. I don't have any justifying answer for our state system. I just know it's one of the better options out there. But as we live in an era where people are looking for real, tangible change in the way that our lives are run, in the things that we expect and the things that we give and receive, examining different configurations gives us an opportunity to question why we do things the way we do. And more importantly, shows us that if something's wrong, the state cannot necessarily change it, but people can. And in following that, we can start to see different avenues of understanding the world in which we live. And that's enough moralizing from me. But finally then, if we return to our sleepy village in Northern Ireland, you'll be happy to know that Edith didn't take her gun, that she didn't put the burglar in her basement, that she didn't demand money for it. Edith didn't take on the processes of statehood herself. She quietly and passively gave authority to the police, trusting them to act correctly on her behalf. And I'll finish with this. Edith grumbled like the rest of us until one night when the unknown burglar returned to break into another house, where he was apprehended, not by the police, but by a St. Bernard. So perhaps I don't need to go on and on about power and authority and legitimacy. If we want to find a well-functioning state, perhaps we all just need to get big dogs and let them deal with it. Well, you've been a wonderful audience, and I'm looking forward to discussing any questions, comments, or disagreements that you have. And hopefully iron can sharpen iron. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, John. Let me just quickly open the chat. So the chat is now open if you have any messages to go in there. That was an excellent lecture. If anybody has any questions, then do please post them into the chat. Or if you're brave enough and want to unmute yourself, then you're very welcome to do so. We can do that. The first question that we have coming in here from Mark, who has said that the documents from Daryl Medina suggest that law was administered by the local courts and some reference to oracles. Do you think this reflects reality through most of the period of Egyptian history?
I think in most human societies, there is some desire to have some kind of collectively defined moral values, which are collectively enforced by some people who do it on behalf of others. Not everyone can be their own police in that setting. So I think, probably not that particular form, but there's always some form of correction towards a defined moral value, if that makes sense. Is that kind of where you were going?
Yeah, does that answer your question, Mark? You can post in the chat or unmute yourself if you want.
Yes, I think so. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any further questions from people? I see.
I've not got a question, but this is something of vague interest maybe. The prison you had, which was sort of in a circle, often they made those because they had an added advantage that prisoners could also see each other and would be prepared to inform on each other to gain favors if the guards didn't. But in certain places in America, when they tried this, it went very wrong because the psychology of the prisoners of never having a second to themselves caused such problems they had to stop doing it.
I'd heard about that, but I must confess that I don't know what those specific problems were.
It was a question of we all need some sort of privacy, and the fact that the prisoners were literally on view 24/7 without a second of being alone apparently pushed them over the edge. My opinion was that they shouldn't have been committing crimes and they waived their rights to privacy when they did bad things, but apparently there's such thing as human rights. I don't know. I don't know what that is, but
But yeah, the Panopticon idea is really interesting, actually. And the idea, and it's very relevant today with things like social media and security cameras and this kind of thing. And I'm not going to go down that route, otherwise I'll start sounding like a conspiracy theorist or something. But, you know, we don't really have this, of course, in the ancient world so much. States today are very data-driven. So the way that states work today is very different. Stuff like the census. Well, you know, ancient states can have rudimentary forms of censuses, but they don't have anywhere near the amount of data that a modern state would have about its populations. So they're very different. But yeah, I'm going off on a tangent there.
May I ask a question, please?
Yep.
Yep.
Circling back all the way to the beginning and taking violence or the ability to legitimately commit violence as the basis, aren't we in danger, if we do that, of looking too much through a modern lens and forgetting the aspect of devotion, the true belief in the gods? I know we're losing that in our current society, but I think in ancient societies, the true belief that the gods were there and had actually bestowed authority, bypassing the violence aspect, but just bestowed authority on the king, might have been also part of the equation. I'm missing that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point that you raise, and I think it is a trend that I've also fed into tonight. That, you know, we look through things through a modern lens, so we look at religion as a tool, whereas, of course, for the majority of people throughout history, it wasn't a tool; it was a way of life. The short answer, yes. We do need to have the two in balance. But what I'm looking at is the process rather than the thought, if I can put it that way. So at the very beginning, well, how does one person and the group of people around that person take a country and then say, look, I am greater than you? How does that start? Of course, once things are going, then yes, a lot of people wouldn't be questioning it. It's just the way that the world is. The gods are there and they have put the king there, or the king or the queen there. So yeah, you're quite right. But I think going back to the very start of any state, you know, how does one person basically convince everyone else that the gods have done that? And I'm interested to see what you think. This is, but yes, I think it does need to take into account the religious side of it, which I've not touched on so much tonight. But yeah, I'm interested to see.
Thank you.
We have a question from Sue, who says that you'd mentioned that Samtek's state was different. So in what way is it different?
Oh, well, the Sayak dynasty is different to what comes before. It's certainly different to the New Kingdom, although it's, you know, the iconography, the architecture, the ideology is referring back to older things. You've got things like in the administration, for a while he gets rid of the gnomes and just lumps middle and upper Egypt into the southern land, the Taaresi. Well, what makes him make that decision? That doesn't really come from anywhere that we can see. The country's having to deal with a very fast-moving Near Eastern situation throughout the Sayak dynasty. Well, the Kushites have waned and are continuing to wane. The Neo-Assyrian Empire goes, the Babylonian Empire rises and then goes, the Lydian kingdom goes, the Persian era arrives. International relations are moving very quickly, and the way in which the Egyptian king has to engage with them is changing. He's one among equals, and of course that's true in different eras as well, but the ways in which they are true are different, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's a change, and one question is, in unifying Egypt? Is Psamtik the first looking back to a golden age, or is he just taking more and more land and using the ideology? But yeah, I hope that answers the questions. Well, maybe not answers, but let's open the discussion.
Does anybody else have any further questions?
I have quite a weird question, or maybe a bit long.
Oh, we love them.
Well, I heard an opinion on the situation considering Hatshepsut's reign as pharaoh. When after a period when she was a regent, she went to going pharaoh. So she had a circle of officials whom she appointed at the beginning of her reign as regent. And maybe these officials, well, and they provoked her to lengthen her reign and to become a pharaoh, so to maintain their own positions. So where is the power authority dynamic in here? I mean, Hatshepsut presumably has this divine authority, well, at least as regent, and these officials, they want to give her their authority and give her power. So how does it look in this situation with power and authority?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on the specifics because I don't really know the specifics of the argument. I don't do too much with Hatshepsut. But what you're describing, I'll assume it's basically true for this discussion, but it may not be. But this is a really interesting idea of when the king becomes a tool, and taking into account what Iris was saying about, we shouldn't be cynical, over cynical, but say the officials are seeking their own position. Everyone wants to get ahead in life, and there are other instances where the king becomes a tool for local officials. So Shoshenq V would be a little bit of an example of this, where some officials they don't fill in his name. They just they reference him, but then talk about themselves on Donation Stealer and some such. So this is really interesting. But basically, this is almost what we expect to happen eventually with rulers, because if there are these relationships where power is being displayed and authority is being given, well, you have to keep very tight control of how much authority and power is moving about, because eventually the king just becomes a honeypot that anyone can dip into, and eventually the honeypot is empty, and it's okay as long as no one realizes the honeypot's empty, if that makes sense. But I can't speak specifically about Hatshepsut, I'm afraid. Sorry, but yeah, it's the idea is not surprising, whether or not it's true in that particular context. For me.
Hopefully that's answered your question. Yeah. Does anybody else have any further questions? I don't know if you have any in the chat, Sam.
No, nothing in the chat. Lots of messages of thanks for John, and lots of people saying it's really been a good introduction to the subject. It's quite a difficult one to get your head around without these analogies. Thank you so much, John. We'll make sure you get a copy of the chat as well, so you can have a look at all the nice things people have been saying about you.
Well, thank you. It's often very difficult to go into theory without people groaning, and yeah. But I thought I would try and crowdsource some people's thoughts to see whether what I'm saying is actually making any sense. This is the problem of being a PhD student in lockdown. There's no one to tell you that you've gone mad, but hopefully I haven't yet. But thank you very much.
And I like that you brought in the Biayats as well with Professor Lloyd in attendance as well. Quite convenient.
One question has just come up, John. Are you intending on publishing any of this research?
Well, I'll probably I need to carry on working on it. You can probably tell that these really are working definitions, and you know, they'll never be finished. But I plan to share them more widely, and then eventually, well, not eventually, in about a year's time, oh dear, they will form the core foundation for the way that my thesis is working. They're kind of being developed in tandem with the rest of the stuff, but basically yes, at some point. So if anyone has any questions or comments or disagreements are sometimes the best things to get, then please feel free to email me as well afterwards with anything. I'll be happy to listen and chat about them.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that excellent lecture. And of course, on behalf of the Friends of the Egypt Centre, and I'm sure everyone in the audience here, we wish you all the best for your PhD as well as your career. It was fantastic to kind of really hear a little snippet of just a small bit of your research, which I'm sure will be fantastic, and no doubt you will publish afterwards. So thank you to everybody who has attended tonight. Thank you, of course, to John. Thank you to Sam for moderating, and hopefully see you all next month on the 14th of April, which is our next Friends of the Egypt Centre lecture by Mark Humphreys. Let me see, I'll actually put up the poster, and then you can see it there. Let's see if hopefully that pauses. There's the details of the poster, the next talk. We'll be looking at Christians and Egyptian temples at the end of antiquity. Mark Humphreys is the professor in ancient history at Swansea University, and the tickets for this event are now available on our Eventbrite page. So do book that and come along if you can. Mark has also given his permission to record the lecture. So if you can't make the event live, then book a ticket and we will email the lecture out to people. So again, thank you very much to John. Thank you to everyone for attending, and for Sam for helping to moderate, and hopefully see you all soon.